Okay, so today we are going to explore what are different things that you can do with watercolor paints and how can you create different textures, colors, and techniques with your paints. So the first thing that I want to do is go over some materials with you. Sorry, I'm just adjusting this camera a little bit more for you. And then you can kind of collect your materials and we'll dive right in. So you need a piece of watercolor paper. This one is about like 10 by 11, 10 by 12. You can be flexible on the size of your paper. So grab what you have around the house. You need some salt, which you can just go ahead and grab from your kitchen. Just one paintbrush is really fine to explore with. I'm going to be using some tape. This is definitely an optional supply. A ruler, which is also an optional supply. This is a little skewer for shish kebabs, so something like this, or a sewing needle. You need something that has a sharp point to it. Some rubber cement, some rubbing alcohol. It does not need to be in a spray bottle. Mine just happens to be in a spray bottle. You need some watercolor paints for this activity. It really doesn't matter. Just grab yourself some watercolor paints, some paper towels, and a bowl of fresh water. Okay, so I'm gonna move these off to the side so that we can start to set up our workspace. So what I'm using the tape for is to actually tape my paper onto the table. I just like to make sure that it stays in place and that it also makes a little bit of a border, which is why this is totally optional. So if you don't happen to have tape, I like to use painter's tape because it easily peels off without ripping your paper. But if it's not something that you just have at home, then don't worry about it because it's not. Oh, you also need a pencil, which I did not mention. Okay, some kind of pencil. I have a mechanical pencil, but it really doesn't matter what kind of pencil as long as you have a pencil. Okay, so the next part, this is where if you want to, you can use a ruler, but a ruler is not really necessary. So on our piece of paper, we're gonna create 12 boxes. You're gonna determine the size of your boxes based on the size of your paper. So I'm gonna do 3 rows of 4 boxes, and I'm just gonna freehand mine, because as I said, this is really about experimentation and trying new things. So it being perfect doesn't really matter. And I'm drawing these with my pencil because we don't really want to see the boxes as we paint. They're just there to guide us. And you'll also see that I'm leaving space around the boxes. And the reason for that is because we're going to be doing some labeling. So this will give us some space to do a little bit of writing around our experiments. So as I said, you can do this with a ruler. You could create yourself a template if you wanted to, but it really does not need to be perfect. And it's more just getting these spaces on our paper. Okay, so we have all of our squares. The first one we're gonna go ahead and label this number 1, which I just wrote a 7. Number 1, and label this as masking. So we need to prep this one because it takes a little bit of dry time. So we're going to go ahead and grab our rubber cement. You can buy masking fluid, but rubber cement tends to be a little bit cheaper and something that people sometimes have a little bit more access to. So you're going to take your rubber cement. You're not doing the entire box. You're just going to do parts of the box. So the reason we have to do this first is because we need to allow that some time to dry. Okay, so we're gonna let that dry and move on to our next box, which we're gonna label box number 2. And this is going to be creating a glaze. I'm copying off of my last thing. we're gonna create a wash, okay? So washes will sometimes be put down to create a background that then you're gonna draw on top of, or sometimes people do a little bit of a drawing first and a quick wash over top to kind of just highlight some areas. So for this first one, we're gonna go ahead and do just a wash without any drawing. So we're gonna get our brush nice and wet in our water bowl and then pick any color that you want. I'm gonna go ahead and grab some yellow. And washes normally are they're a little bit lighter, so you're not trying to be really opaque. They're kind of free. So you can see I'm continuing to go in and add some more water so that's not quite so dark, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and let that dry. And number 3, we're gonna do a wash plus a drawing, just as an experiment. So we're gonna take our pencil, and you can just make any type of marks within this box so that you can see what it might look like if you did a drawing and then did a wash on top of it. Okay, and maybe I want something kind of popping out up here. Okay, so now we have a drawing on our paper first. I'm gonna rinse our brush. I'm gonna get a new color. Make sure I have a lot of water on my brush. And I'm gonna go in and bring this right over top of my drawing. So part of this in going nice and light is we can easily, you can play with bringing another color in your wash if you want, but you can still see your drawing through your wash, but it's just about kind of washing that color over top of everything. Okay, so number 4, we're gonna jump into doing what is called wet on wet. So we're gonna get your brush nice and clean. And then we're going to start by, you're just gonna paint your paper with water. So this is the wet on wet part. You're making it wet first. Then we're gonna go back and grab our color, and you can see as we dab that onto the wet, it starts to do its own little flowing and can create some really interesting textures. If you want, you can drop another color in there and let those colors bleed together. Now you'll see when you're doing wet on wet, you don't have quite as much control of things because the paint tends to flow where the water's flowing. Okay, so that is wet on wet. Number 5, we're gonna play with our rubbing alcohol. If you don't have it in a spray bottle, you can also just kind of drip it on with, if you have an eyedropper or if you have a Q-tip, you can dab it. So we're gonna start by putting some paint down on our paper. So we're gonna paint our box in with our paint. Okay, and then while our paint is still wet, we're gonna add some alcohol. And you're gonna see as soon as that alcohol goes in, it starts to change the flow of the paint. So it can create some kind of interesting bubbles and textures within your paint. And you do have a little bit more control if you're using like a Q-tip or something like that as opposed to the spray bottle. So for number 6, we're gonna do a color fade into a color. So we're gonna use 2 different colors here. And I'm gonna go ahead and get my first color, which is gonna be red, and I'm gonna paint that at the top of my page, but we're not going all the way down to the middle. Then I'm gonna go ahead and grab my second color, which I'm gonna pull some yellow in, and we're gonna put yellow down at the bottom. Now we're gonna leave some of that center part just white, and come in with a clean brush that's wet and work on introducing these two colors to each other. And you'll see they start to, I could bring in a little bit more red if I want some more orange to happen, as they start to fade into each other. So that can be a fun way to create a gradient with two different colors. So the next one, which is going to be block number 7, we are going to do sgraffito, which is spelled S-C-R-A-F-F-I-T-O. And this is where you need your sharp tool. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my needle, and you're drawing into the paper. So you're making scratches into your paper. And you can be really intentional about this, or you can be really playful with it. And you'll see the different tools that you use are going to create different weights of lines. So like this, my skewer, the lines are wider than my needle. All right, so I have a decent amount of texture going on in there. And now you're gonna just go in and paint right over top of that. So I'm gonna grab some orange, and what you should see is you're gonna see that texture shining through. So it can create some really interesting, some of your paint's gonna sink more into those scratched areas. So that's gonna get a little bit darker and create an interesting texture for you. Okay, so block number 8, we are going to do a gradient in block number 8. So this is going to be a 1-color gradient, but you're gonna see it's very similar to the 2-color fade that we did. So I'm gonna grab some of my blue and go ahead and just put a blue line up there at the top. Then I'm gonna rinse my brush for the most part. So I'm mainly using water, and start to just pull that. I might rinse my brush again. Pull this down the page so it gets lighter and lighter as we go. So a little paint at the top, and then you're mainly painting with water so that it lightens as you go down the page. Next up, so we're on block number 9, we're gonna experiment with our salt. So go ahead and paint one of your squares color. You do need to do the salt while your paint is still wet. So we're gonna get a nice layer of paint in there. And then we're gonna grab our salt, start to scatter that on here. Right away, you should see that your salt is starting to absorb some of the water and some of the paint. And that's gonna create a really great texture. So we need to let that sit on there while it dries some more. So we're gonna jump on to our next one, and we're gonna make a paper towel texture. As we work on these, it's also important to note that there are tons and tons of things that you can do with watercolor. These are some of my favorites and a really good place to start to explore, but you can always find more or just experiment and see what you can actually come up with. So I'm gonna go ahead and get some paint on my paper. I'm gonna pull some green in here too, just for fun. Layering some colors. Then take a piece of paper towel. And I'm gonna crinkle mine up, but you can experiment with this in different ways. So I'm gonna crinkle, push and lift, push and lift. And you can see, because our paper towel is sucking up some of that paint, that it's creating some interesting textures within our watercolor paint. Then on to number 11. So this is a technique that you've actually been doing for most of this exercise, but I want to make sure that you know that it's what it's actually called. So this is wet on dry. So if you remember all the way up here at number 4, we did wet on wet, which was making the paper wet and then adding wet paint onto that. Wet on dry is leaving the paper dry and adding our paint onto the paper, which as you do this, what I want you to think about now is really the difference in the amount of control that you have over your paint. Okay, so when you do wet on wet, it creates some really fun organic textures, but you don't have as much control over the flow of your paint, where when the paper's dry, you're more in control of moving your paint around the paper. And then this last one, this is a free space. So maybe one of these techniques we already did, you want to try it in a different color, you want to experiment with it a little bit more. What I'm actually going to try for my free space is I'm going to put some rubbing alcohol down on my page first. I'm gonna let that sit so it kind of like soaks into the paper a little bit. Maybe spread it around some with my paper towel. And I'm gonna see what happens when I add my paint on top of the rubbing alcohol and see if that changes anything. And doesn't really look like it's doing that much, does it? Okay, so I can mark off. Not really that interesting if you add rubbing alcohol first. So there we go. Then the last one we're gonna do is we're gonna jump back up here to your masking fluid. Pick your color. I'm gonna paint right over top. And you're gonna see your masking fluid is gonna start to kind of push your paint away some. We're gonna let that dry, and after it's dry, you can rub away where the rubber cement was. And what that lets you do, you can draw into that, you can add more colors into that, or you can just leave it white. It gives you a little bit more flexibility than if you did like a crayon resist. And put the crayon down first, because once the crayon is there, you can't add anymore. You can't really reverse it. It is just how it is. So once this is all dry, you're gonna brush your salt off so that you can see the interesting textures that it has created for you. And then you're gonna also rub away your rubbing alcohol. So take a couple minutes, look over these different techniques, think about which ones you thought were really fun that you might want to play with some more. So I really love this texture that I got with the paper towel. The other thing that I'm kind of looking at that you can see me doing now, I like these edges that it created. So I'm actually going in with my pencil, following those edges around, so that they become kind of really highlighted. So this is one that I'm saying I like this one, so I'm gonna put a star by that. I love doing wet on wet, so I'm gonna put a star by that one. I do like playing with washes over top of drawings, so I'm gonna also put a star there. And I'd like to further explore rubbing alcohol, so I'm gonna put that there. So that helps me to know that as I move forward into my next painting, those are gonna be some things that I wanna work on incorporating.